On the 22nd of November 2003, England made me the happiest birthday boy ever and won the William Web Ellis Cup. England had run their zigzag pattern to get Johnny Wilkinson in position to kick that goal. He kicked it, and 20 seconds later, Mike Catt was booting the ball off the field. Now, this achievement had been achieved not by luck, but by design. England had arrived in Australia as the world's best team, not only favourites, but having beaten all the major nations home and away over the period of the last 2 years. This is an achievement that since 2003, no other English team has been able to replicate. There have been periods of form and dominance, namely when Eddie Jones first came in as England coach, but where England were undisputedly the best team in the world, no, that has not happened since. England achieved this through a fanatical devotion to winning. A fanatical devotion. Today, that is what we are going to be discussing, how England became the world's best. Now, I never intended to make this video. This video, if I made it, was never going to be just about the rugby, and that's why I wasn't going to make it. I could get biased, and in more ways than one. See, when I started this channel, I promised myself 3 things. 1, that I would own my mistakes. 2, I'd try to improve every video that I do. And 3, I would always keep it about the rugby. Unfortunately, I can't guarantee that will be the case in one of these tenets. You see, this does get personal. This one. However, the thing that convinced me to do this video wasn't some patriotic last night at the proms or, some English tea party or something like that. It was something considerably more unexpected. It was a Will Ferrell film. A Will Ferrell film. You see, after work a couple of months ago, I was flicking through Netflix looking for something to watch and came across a new Will Ferrell film about Eurovision, which I actually quite like if I'm honest. At face value, it had everything I could want in a Will Ferrell film. Random comedy, good one-liners, a classic shirtless scene, penis references, and of course a little bit of a side note, taking a dump on my second favourite Christmas movie of all time.
Hear me out.
Hold on.
No.
Elves again.
Don't do it.
You know I have nothing to do with elves.
I don't know what the elves say. I don't believe in the elves, but...
The elves don't exist, Secret.
Yeah, I was shocked as well. Totally shits on it. But at the end, I pretty much resembled this guy, if I'm being honest. At the end of this film, I resembled this guy. I won't ruin the film for those who haven't seen it, but the story really made you root for these guys. It really made you root for them. It became quickly obvious that this film had a love story more powerful than Up, a redemption arc greater than Theon Greyjoy's, the underdog nature of Japan versus South Africa, and most importantly, the same pride the Japanese people would have felt that day. Not to mention that if justice means anything, a song that should win an Oscar. But for me, the most underlying factor in this film, the most underlying emotion, was pride. See, at the end of the film, when it's all come into its climax and, it's all getting rather amazing, Will Ferrell and Rachel McAdams, they sing a song, and the song is a change from what was originally lined up. It actually turns into a song about Iceland and their hometown. And it really, really resonated with me, if I'm being perfectly honest. It really struck a chord. I am a very proud Englishman. You don't wear this get-up to a Welsh pub on game day if you're not. This was 2017, which meant it turned into a really good day for me. But originally, my family name comes from the Vikings who settled northern Scotland in the Middle Ages. And judging by the DNA test I took last year, some Scandinavian great-granddaddy must have got busy with a Norwegian great-grandmummy, because there is a surprising amount in there. The thing is, I don't know what country, that part of my heritage comes from. I don't know if it's Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic. I have absolutely no idea. What I do know is when they started singing this song about Iceland, I started to be welled up with a little bit of pride, much like these actors. At this point, they knew they'd lost. Everyone at home knew they'd lost. They'd changed their song. But they were still unbelievably proud of this performance because it was a song about home. I found myself getting patriotic about a fictional band in a fictional film singing a song about a country that I have no affinity for, have never been, and the only connection I've got is probably some very long-lost heritage. See, the thing is, this feeling reminded me of 2003, seeing that many people fly the English flag and be that proud to be English. Even on St. George's Day, it's not something that really happens that often, which is a shame. I mean, I was here this day. I actually bunked school to go to the parade, and it was absolutely amazing. You had people from all walks of life singing God Save the Queen, Jerusalem, Swing Low, waving their flags. It was amazing, and you could see the excitement and pride on people's faces. Yet, it wasn't just us who knew we were the best team in the world. You had other columnists from other countries who, in the year leading up to the World Cup, had literally said England were the best team in the world and it was going to take some heavy, heavy team to beat them. This is what Clive Woodward had created. He had gone out to make a team of winners. He didn't want it to be happening by luck. He wanted everything England did to be geared towards winning, and therefore when they won, they deserved to win. This created the attitude and the culture that led to England becoming the world champions and led to them beating everyone in the lead up to the 2003 World Cup. Today is the first of a two-part documentary where we break down England 2003. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the changing culture, the set piece and the attack. Next video, we will be looking at the kicking and the defensive game of England, arguably the most important thing in their World Cup victory. I am thoroughly aware this is a long documentary. As such, I've included snap points of each of the categories in the description. So if you haven't got time for the full thing, go there, you can have a look at it now, but hopefully you'll enjoy this.
If you look back at the history of the Six Nations Rugby, Five Nations Rugby, no one remembers teams that win the championship. The only teams you remember are those who win a Grand Slam.
We won the championship when we lost to Ireland last game of the season. You feel home in on some of the boys and they're pinning the sort of Six Nations medal championship winners round our necks, and it's just like, yeah, it doesn't quite feel right picking up this trophy when we've just lost.
As a player, you really remember the ones who lost probably more than the ones who won in this situation. Probably got the best record of any team over the last 5 years in the Six Nations, but everyone remembers Wales at Wembley or Scotland in 2000 or Ireland at Dublin, rather than scoring 50 points against Ireland or Wales or beating France 2 years ago.
You don't want to be remembered as a player who was a very good player or part of a team that was a very good team but didn't actually win anything. It does niggle a little bit, and that won't change until you actually win something.
I mean, I lay awake for 2 or 3 days just because we've played some great rugby and lost the game, and I don't want to miss opportunities. I don't ever want to experience it again.
After the 1999 World Cup, winning became everything to England. Everything that England did was geared towards winning. This became the main drive after the 1999 quarter-final against South Africa, where Yanni de Beer kicked over 5 drop goals to knock England out of the World Cup. This game was the true turning point for England. Admittedly, they did have losses later. 1999 against Wales with Scott Gibbs' last-minute try. You had Ireland 2001. You had Scotland in 2000. You had all these games where they were so close, but yet so far. However, England treated every one of these losses as a lesson, and they got better and better to the point where 2003 probably wouldn't have happened without them. Because the standard was winning and everything was geared towards winning, every loss hurt these England players, like Johnny Wilkinson makes clear here, and they learnt from them, unlike some other coaches we might know. Out of every loss came the passion to develop further, and this is what drove England's strategy. Their strategy was simple: change the mindset, establish the most professional setup in the world, and aspire to total rugby. Total rugby is the goal. First, we are going to look at England's change in mindset under Woodward. He knew that with all the innovations and the tricks and the attacking play that he could teach, it would mean nothing if they didn't change their mindset, and that is what we're going to look at now. So Clive's job was to take England into the professional era, and he did this the only way that he knew how. He took the lessons that he'd learned in business and applied them to this England team.
You learn far more from success than you do from losses. Far more. I use my business analogy. Now, I remember talking about this before I even started coaching. That in business, what happens, if you get the big deal, do something fantastically well, everyone goes out to the pub, success, open shop. You lose the big deal, it's the 8 o'clock Monday morning meeting, everyone's in, what the hell's happened? To me, it's the complete reverse. When you win the big deal or being successful, that's where you meet Monday morning at 8 o'clock, find out why you won, why you've been successful, how you can now be better. So you concentrate success and go from there. If you lose the big deal, go down the pub and get pissed. And that's what rugby's about. It's as long as you're being successful all the way, you're going to get the odd blip. That's when you don't overreact. You take it on a few points. But England, I think, have gone from there to there. But it's not been a straight line. We've gone like there, we've had the odd blip, but then we've immediately, constant success, we've gone on again. So every time we've lost, we've got, when we lost to France last February, it was a disaster for us. The roof caved in, but we've not lost since. Touch wood. And I think that's what we've been good at doing. We concentrate on why we're winning, and we've got better and better and better, and we're still doing that. Bringing new ideas, new people. And we've not had the massive ever panic critical meetings because we lost one game.
So Clive Woodward was not a passion coach. Even though he was a very passionate man and very passionate about England, he was a business coach, very much like Rob McQueen of Australia, who also led Australia in a very similar vein to how he led England. Sir Clive and Rob McQueen were both businessmen. They had both built businesses from the ground up, and as such they knew how to win in a very cutthroat market. Sir Clive Woodward knew that the business approach was the way forward for the England team. This is because he knew the business approach is what wins. It wins in real life. It is what separated his business from countless others, which is why he invited the executives from Sainsbury's, all the big British companies, into his training sessions. They got to meet the players, fanboy and girl of Johnny Wilkinson, but in return, Clive wanted one improvement from them that England could make. Sir Clive was not the first manager or coach to actually go down this route. Billy Bean of the Oakland A's had turned his team into winners against the odds by taking lessons from Wall Street stockbrokers. This meant they had the third lowest budget in baseball, and yet, because of their statistical analysis, they had the best team in the league, which won 20 consecutive games. Innovation and change were rife in the England team. After discovering post-half-time the England performance was dipping, England started changing their shirts and kit at half-time to set a new frame of mind and to counter this. It was simple, but it worked. The England performances in the 10 minutes after half-time started going through the roof, and it's all because of this change of thinking. Gone was the amateurism of the early 90s. Instead, Clive Woodward had a fully professional business approach set up in the England training camp, complete with bottled water and conference rooms. This was called their war room, and like it, no one was allowed to drink in there. No one was allowed to congregate or socialise in there. It was strictly for business. Key decision makers and captains in the attack and defence were nominated, and they, along with the coaches, would lead the game plan and lead the sessions. They would be breaking down everything that they were going to be doing on game day, how they would attack, how they would defend, particular players to look out for. It was all run by the players. Basically, Clive had turned himself into an executive CEO, and the players and the management under him were department heads and directors and managers. That is what they were. That is what they were being given, the element of leadership and the element of ownership of the game plan. This leadership made them better people, and as Graham Henry once said, better people make better rugby players, or in his case, better All Blacks. To help develop these skills, Sir Clive turned to a very special group of men in order to help his England players. These men were the Commando Training Wing of the CTCRM at Lympstone. I've had dealings with these guys in the past. They're great-humoured blokes, funny, enjoy the wet and cold way too much, but when it comes to the field, they're determined, resilient, thoroughly professional and adaptable blokes who are generally nails as anything. The Marines, or Royals as we may call them, are Britain's commando force. They are the most elite we have, bar Hereford and Poole, and as such, Clive Woodward wanted to learn from them. It wasn't so much their fitness or their nutrition regime that he wanted to learn from. What he really wanted to learn was their leadership under contact. There's an old saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy, which basically means that even the best laid plans that you lay up will absolutely go to shit the second that rounds start coming in. Clive understood that rugby and warfare share similarities. Battle is a fluid motion, and so is rugby. All the plans and all the moves that you lay up can change in a heartbeat, and your players, being able to adapt to that, is what you want to have. As such, they were sent to Lympstone, and from Lympstone, there were 3 key learnings that Sir Clive took out. One was Auftragstaktik, which we'll go into a second. The second was Energisers versus Sappers, exactly what makes a team click. And thirdly was learning from the truly elite environment, the standards that are needed to drive the commandos. The first and most important lesson that they learnt, however, was Auftragstaktik. To let you understand this, I'm going to let you read a slide, just so it can really break it down. In the Battle of France, the Germans were able to use Auftragstaktik to revolutionise warfare, and it's what's responsible for their rapid advance through France. Basically speaking, Auftragstaktik means the opposite of micromanagement, and I'm going to show you exactly how, because there's a pretty good clip coming up that really describes it in detail.
I'm sure there's a different way to manage people than micromanagement and red tape and process or being a rock star, and I got my inspiration here, which is very strange. Now, when you think about the German army, you're probably thinking about these guys, goose-stepping, jackbooted Nazis, blazing a trail across Europe. But it turns out they have a really interesting system of management, command and control, which they've had for about 200 years. Now, here's the history bit. In 1806, the Prussians got their ass kicked by Napoleon at a battle called Jena and Auerstadt. And what happened was both sides were evenly matched, but they were badly managed. And they came up against a military genius, and he basically wiped the floor with them. Now, present that day were these handsome-looking gentlemen, right? And they spent the rest of their careers redesigning the structure of the German army, but only at the top, right? They were interested in making life easy for the generals and giving them more freedom of action, more ability to use their initiative. Fast forward 60 years, and people don't move soldiers around the battlefield in large blocks. What they do is they all run around on their own, and they have to think for themselves. And this guy, von Moltke, what he did was he took all of that learning from the general staff and he pushed it down right to the bottom of the German army. And this is the name of the system that they came up with. Anybody want to venture a pronunciation? Auftragstaktik, roll that R, right? So what it means basically is mission command. And what I want to do is explain to you how it works and why it might be useful. In the German army, you're very unlikely to be given a direct order. Instead, what they do is they give you an objective, and how you meet that is your problem. They don't interfere, no micromanagement. So they're also going to give you the big picture, the commander's intent, right? And the beauty about this is it's okay to be different. It's okay in the German army to disobey orders as long as you understand the big picture, and the way in which you disobey orders is actually within the framework of the big mission, what you're all trying to do. Everybody understands the big picture. And this has some amazing results. So this place is an underground fortress bristling with armoured turrets. And in May 1940, the Germans had to take this to invade France. And this was accomplished despite everything in the mission going wrong by a junior lieutenant, by a sergeant, and by 70 paratroopers. Now, how do they do this? Well, they trust people and they devolve responsibility right down to the bottom of the organization. Every German soldier is required to act effectively 2 ranks above his own rank. So they give him a lot of responsibility at a very low level. They're also big into cross-training. Everybody understands everybody else's job because they've all had an opportunity to work in different parts of the military. So responsibility, cross-training, and giving people objectives and the freedom to actually achieve them on their own terms. This is the secret of the German army.
That fortress was Fortress Abana-Mayel in Belgium. This tactic and this leadership style was so effective that it is now taught at Sandhurst and CTCRM because, quite simply, it blitzes any other leadership style. In the Sandhurst orders process, you are given the 1-up and the 2-up intent, so everyone knows everyone's role and what everyone needs to do and the impact your mission will have. This is why you have privates who can take the roles of corporals and corporals who can take the role of sergeant if needs be. A young troopie may tell his section, okay, you're going to go and take that position, you're going to go through that wadi to do it. However, the corporal won't lead his men through that wadi because he knows it's probably been IED'd to absolute buggery. As such, he takes them in a different way, but they still take the position. This is what Sir Clive Woodward wanted. He wanted a team of leaders, a team who could adapt to the circumstances on the pitch and make the best decisions at the time. He took care of this with his off-field approach, making sure they were totally involved in the business-like approach of the attack and defence and the way that they ran it. However, he also wanted them to be able to handle that in the stresses of rugby, and that's why he went to the Marines to help them cultivate that leadership. This meant he had a team of players that could rise to the occasion, wouldn't crumble under pressure, and they had the ability to make the right decisions at the right time, therefore making them all the more dangerous as a team. The next thing Clive was brought to attention to was the energy sappers in his squad. Energy sappers and energizers is what the Marines called this. The Marines training is some of the hardest training that you can go through as a military man. It is unbelievably arduous, and you cannot get through it without a good attitude. This attitude is one where you have to be tough, but you also have to be a team player. And if you're not, you get scrubbed out. You need to have certain qualities to pass the course, and these are exemplified by the commando spirit. Courage, determination, cheerfulness in the face of adversity, and unselfishness. Cheerfulness in the face of adversity became a non-negotiable for Clive after he was alerted to the energy sappers by the Marines. The point is, when you are soaking wet, or you're going man down with hypo, or you're in a world of trouble, you haven't slept in a couple of days, or you're hungry, you don't want people who are going to complain. You want people who are going to raise morale and raise the spirit, and that is what is exemplified by cheerfulness in the face of adversity. Only one bad apple can bring down an entire team. If there's one complaining, whining person, that person can bring down the entire team. The Marines deemed this that important that they actually handed Clive a list of players, and these players were the energy sappers. They deemed it that important that they said to him, "We would not take these men into battle." Clive very quickly realised that this could not be allowed to continue. As such, he took them aside and literally briefed them and tried to convert them over to Energisers. If they couldn't be turned, he got rid of them. This meant by 2003, when Clive went to Australia, he had a team of 31 players who were all Energisers, all bought into the team culture, and all the men that he wanted. All of them had the commando spirit. All of this contributed to the truly elite environment. The Marines raised their standards of what they knew as elite and what was expected of their very best. In a bid to improve the winning potential and winning personalities in his players, Clive Woodward contacted Yehuda Shinar, an Israeli life coach. Yehuda had studied the personalities of the high-performing men and women on this planet. Special Forces veterans, military men, athletes, businessmen, all guys who were at the very, very top of their game. He then broke down what they had in common. He broke down the common traits that they had, and he broke them into 11 high-performance behaviours, and these were told to Sir Clive Woodward. With this, he developed a computer program, a software that would actually train the winning behaviours and the things that these guys had in other individuals, and as such, England's players were being trained in winning on a software that was crazy, but yet worked. All this combined together to create a culture that led to England being the best team in the world, where no compromises were made, they would always pursue excellence, and they were always good team players and helped each other. Next up, we go into professionalism. Rugby had just turned professional, and Sir Clive's biggest strength was bringing England into the professional era, and he did this with a myriad of ways.
Rugby union and my whole history of rugby union as a coach was always based on coaching with the ball. I never coached defence in my life. I don't think I'd probably ever been taught to tackle in my life as a player. Certainly no, we'd never spoken when I played for England about defence. And what you have in American football is 6 defensive coaches, 6 attacking coaches or offensive coaches, 1 head coach. So you've got a coaching team of 13 people. It was then a case of going to the RFU and fighting like hell for budgets and bringing people on.
You normally got a forwards coach and a backs coach with England, and he's walked in, he's gone, right, no, I want a defensive coach. I want a kicking coach, a throwing coach, like for the hookers. I want a scrummaging coach.
Clive's approach was based around getting the right people for the job in the room. That was what his biggest strength was. As a businessman, he knew that there could be no compromises when it came to the high performance. He knew his limitations. He knew he couldn't coach defence. He knew he couldn't coach kicking to the levels that other guys could. As such, he went out, and what he did is he found people who could.
I just want to give you a very, very simple answer to the word motivation. I think the word motivation is the biggest sort of bollocks I've ever come across, and I find it very difficult to answer that question. What I do understand with motivation is this, that the only way you motivate a team is very, very simple. You get the right people in the room. If you get the right people in the room, the right people on the bus tomorrow, the right people in the changing room, motivation, in my experience, just take care of itself.
Getting the right people in the room was the mantra of the South African win in 2019. It wasn't about getting the best people, it was about getting the right people, and it's something that Rassie was also doing along with Sir Clive in 2003. See, Clive's natural place, his natural position, wasn't that of head coach. It wasn't that of head coach at all, because the head coach is different to what he became. What Clive became was the director of rugby. Much like a CEO to a departmental head to a business head, it wasn't a hands-on role. He would delegate. He would have other specialist coaches working with the players. This was in the opposite to guys like Graham Henry, who at the time were very hands-on coaches, who ran pretty much everything. Graham Henry would run attack, he could run defence, he ran pretty much everything bar the scrums and the set piece, and he would also run the analysis and the post-match analysis of the games that they played as well. This was very different to the approach that Clive took, where he understood as coaching director, he would basically bring in the guys who had specialist knowledge within their own areas and they would run and own that. Phil Larder, a league specialist, was brought in to coach defence and therefore introduced a brand new system that became the most destructive system in world rugby. This is something that Matt Rogers could certainly attest to. To put it into perspective, Matt Rogers now has a dislodged rib, which makes surfing very, very hard for him. To coach kicking, an ex-NFL kicker, Dave Allred, was brought in, and his work was so bloody effective that he's the reason that Johnny Wilkinson became the kicker that he was. Wilco was the best kicking 10, probably of all time, and as such, he could pull off kicks like this. Allred created an entire England backline that could kick, and now the Queensland Reds, after hiring him, are experiencing the benefits of having a coach of this calibre on their coaching staff. This goes for the forwards too, who are also getting very, very good at kicks under his tutelage. It was all about getting the right people on board, and that is what Clive did. His last appointment was Andy Robinson, the forwards coach. It's no secret that England had a powerhouse pack, but they needed to be channeled and channeled effectively, and that is what Andy Robinson did. He took a powerhouse pack and taught them the secrets and the skills that they would need to become even better, brought the composure along with them, and even when they got stopped so many times, they had the power and the precision to just keep going on this drive. Giving the players the mindset and getting the right people in the room was 90% of the journey for England, but that tends to the question, what is the remaining 10%? What will make that 90% team to a 100% team? The answer can be found in the performance of a team that had taken Clive's lessons on during the time of his high-performance director days in the London 2012 Olympics. This team was British Cycling, the best cycling team without question in the world. Headed up by Sir David Brailsford, head of Team Sky and of British Cycling, their approach became very similar to the England approach under Clive Woodward. Winning became absolutely everything, as did their shared philosophy of Kaizen, or marginal gains as it's more commonly known. Getting the right people in alignment with this philosophy resulted in unprecedented success for Team Sky and British Cycling. Everything they did was geared towards winning and peaking at the Olympics, and their medal tally at the Olympics went through the absolute roof. These tiny little things that they were doing needed the right people to execute them. See, getting the right people in the room also means getting the people who are going to sacrifice the most, who are going to strive for absolute perfection, and that is what British Cycling were aiming to do. The cyclists had to sleep in a particular sleeping position. They had to eat exactly what they were told. They had electrostatically painted buses that meant that they wouldn't inhale dust on the way to and from the events. They had to observe proper hospital hand-washing technique at all times so they wouldn't get sick. They had to do so many of these tiny little things that were driven by their desire to succeed. These little things added up to the effect that they were so good that other teams started to question their methods. They started to accuse them of doping. They started to accuse them of drugs, of all these things that they could think of because they were getting annoyed at British Cycling's domination of the event. The French coaches, the Australian coaches, German coaches, so many coaching teams around the world have questioned British Cycling's success because they just don't understand how they can peak for the Olympics in that fashion. This meant world record after world record after world record. In Rio de Janeiro, in the velodrome, you actually saw when the British team came to the fore, every single team went out to the walls to watch them because they wanted to know what they were up against. And the result was, again, exactly the same as what they came up against in London. The ability and the mindset needed to follow these tiny little rules day in, day out, however, are not found in abundance. You need total utter dedication in your guys in order to actually follow these, and the way that they did it was with a strong team culture, and adherence to these rules would actually get them to the place they needed to be. They got the cyclists to believe that, and therefore you got the result. These were tiny little innovations, tiny things that they followed religiously because they knew if you deliver the right people to the right environment, you will get right 5-star performances, and that was the philosophy of England Rugby and British Cycling. It may have been considered overkill. For the RFU, it certainly seemed overkill. Their budget was going out the window like nobody's business, and as such, they didn't understand why the players needed laptop computers, why they needed their own hotel rooms, why they needed first-class travel everywhere. It was all because they needed to give the players the best environment for the best performances.
Further proof of Woodward's relentless search for anything that might give the team an edge.
I use the term critical non-essentials. You know, You don't win a test match because you've got better clothes than the All Blacks. Or you don't win a test match because you arrive in a bus with a big England rose on. But when you add up all these hundreds of things, I think that's where you do win.
Often it was flying in the face of a lot of criticism as well from external people. Well, why are you spending this amount of, why do you have to stay in the best hotels? Why do you have to travel first class everywhere?
We had all the players with laptop computers and all this, and some of the people here were saying, well, why is he not giving them more raw meat?
In the pursuit of excellence everywhere, England's backroom staff expanded to embrace experts for aspects of the game no one else had even thought of.
We've brought this lady in 6 months before the World Cup called Cheryl Calder, who's an eye coach, which in simple terms, it's your weight training your eyes. The eyes are probably the most important muscle in your body when you're playing sport. So you've got to train them. And that is done by doing exercise on computers. And the players do this for 20 minutes every day. If you see a gymnasium, stick in 6 laptops next to all the weights, and you just work on there, and the work you're doing is strengthening your eye muscles. So you're laughing like most people laughed when I first spoke to people here about it. Oh, he's mad again, what's he on about?
Woodward's army of specialists was ridiculed and envied in equal measure. As well as an eye coach, there was a video analyst, a medical team of 4, a nutritionist, a chef, and even their own QC.
This level of professionalism that was taken by Sir Clive Woodward's team was something that had not been seen in rugby up until that point. When the Lions tour happened in 2001, the England players were used to a much higher standard of living and operation than the Lions were able to provide. The Lions were using video analysis, whereas they had DVD analysis and proper business-like approach. Neil Back, the open side flanker for England, actually recounted a story when he walked into the canteen in the Lions tour. He walked in, saw what was on the menu, and then went over to one of the analysts and instantly said, "We are not going to win this tour. We are not going to win because there is food on that menu that the England players would not even consider, never even consider eating." England's players regularly had hair samples taken and sent to Harley Street to analyse their diet to make sure that when they were away from the England camp, they were maintaining those standards. They were maintaining the standards that were needed to eventually get them to where they wanted to be, World Cup champions. It was fanatical, but in Clive's mind, the margins at test level are so minute, you need every advantage to work in your favour, and by doing this, England made sure they had as much in their favour as possible. This culminated in their playing style, which was chasing total rugby, relearning to play total rugby.
England really had a good team. They were probably the complete team from number 1 to number 15 plus the reserves on the bench. I don't think there was a flaw in their game. They were really powerful in the scrums. They were good line-out jumpers. They could maul, they could run, they could defend, they could do everything.
That glowing testimonial from Andre Watson was down to Woodward's insistence at one guy's philosophy. This guy's name is Jim Greenwood, a Scottish former player and coaching father of the term now known as Total Rugby, and author of the book Total Rugby. This book should be required reading for any coach or player who wants to take their game to the next level, because quite simply, it is the best book on coaching I've ever read and ever will read. Clive was coached by Greenwood at Loughborough, and the approach he was taught there found its way down to the England team. England in 2003 were called boring. They were called 10-man rugby merchants, they were called kickers, they were called guys that just used their pack, they didn't really throw the ball or run the ball around, they were basic boring, and more boring. That is what the media all over the world, bar Britain's media, said. They were a one-trick pony, according to these guys. Get the ball into the 22 with their pack, give the ball to Wilco, and kick the balls over. That is basically what everyone said England were about. But the thing is, winning rugby takes many, many forms. England did have games where they just trucked it up in the maul, or they just kicked for territory. They did have those games where they just defended like their lives depended on it. And they did that because they could. According to a Kiwi columnist, England's pack were the stuff of nightmares, so of course England were going to use them in this way. England's rolling maul, England's scrum, England's line-out, England's kicking game, these were very, very, very big pluses in their favour, and their kicking game and defence is arguably what won the World Cup for England. But they had these at their disposal, and of course they were going to use them. Winning rugby comes first, but when the weather decided it was so, they would play attractive running rugby, where they would run the ball out of their 22 with offloads, skill, speed, aggression, and they would go forward near unstoppably with the power of their pack. This was personified by their ruthlessness to win. The qualities that had been coached and identified to them by Yehuda Shinar were finally taking effect and finally starting to come together. When England isolated a gap, they exploited it mercilessly. When they were behind the line, they kept the attack going with skill sets and processes to actually keep the attack on the move, because they wanted to keep their foot on the throat of the opposition at all times. Qualities like work rate, communication, momentum, making sure that they're constantly going forward and constantly in support of each other resulted in tries like this against Ireland, and against South Africa resulted in tries where offloads were rife, and the drive to keep going forward and keep the attack on the move was there from the get-go. England wanted to make sure under Clive Woodward they finished their opportunities. Clive was in charge of the attack, and he wanted to make sure that when a break was made, they finished it, that the support would be there and they would take the ball right to the line. Even when it broke down, they would still work their asses off to get it going again. This mindset meant when the attack had broken down or it wasn't on the move and you thought it was over, they would make sure they got it going again as soon as possible. Their next adage to Total Rugby was that the fly half wasn't the main first receiver for England. In fact, the back three were the default first receivers in phase play. Not always, but 60%, 70% of the time, give or take, they were the first receivers and the playmakers who made the plays in multi-phase attack. Whether it was Josh Lucy, Jason Robinson, Ben Cohen, Phil Christophers, James Simpson-Daniel or Matt Perry, the back three were the default first receivers, with Wilco operating usually at second receiver. This not only resulted in many tries being scored with this configuration, but it also meant Wilco was free for the killer pass to make the break when it was needed, and that is his position at second receiver and why he was here for the majority of the attacks. By doing this, England had multiple playmakers in their backline. They had 5 playmakers in their backline because Will Greenwood was also a very proficient first receiver as well, who would also come in and make plays of his own. Here, we see Ben Cohen and Jason Robertson in that order actually operate at first receiver, not only to distribute to the backline, but to make breaks against the folding forwards where their footwork and elusiveness would prove the most effective. They were not only playmakers, but they were some of England's best attackers, and therefore they could make ground close to the ruck against the forwards and get more involved in the game. Though this didn't mean that they didn't also occupy space on the wings as well. As a general rule, we'll go into a little bit later. The main strength of their positioning here, however, was to free up Wilco for the second receiver, therefore enabling him to make the killer pass that would get England's attack on the move and therefore find the space. Here we see Josh Lucy coming in at first receiver, even though the ball eventually finds Will Greenwood. It constantly meant even if Wilco was out of play, the backline had a playmaker to take over the attack and take charge of the line. This meant England could always keep the attack on the move even if Wilco was out of play. As a general rule, England always made sure that they had 2 back 3 players ready at first receiver, with the other out wide, but ready to move in on the switch pattern and take the ball at first at a moment's notice. This is why the back 3 often had these little analysis meetings with Wilco on board, because they wanted to make sure that all 4 of them were on point and knew what they were doing on that game. Another dedication, and almost the holy grail of Total Rugby, was their use of forwards at first receiver as well. One of the key objectives towards attaining Total Rugby is that every player, be it a prop, a lock, a back, a scrum half, a wing, can step in at first receiver and call plays. They can step in as a first receiver, as a support player, they can attack, they can defend, they can do everything. That is the key objective to attaining Total Rugby. They were not limited by the stereotyped roles of their position. They could kick, they could make plays, they could do absolutely anything they wanted to contribute to the attack because the number on their back did not matter. Here, we see Phil Vickery step in at first receiver. The ruck is cleared, and then the next phase, the first receiver is occupied by Ben Cohen, who comes in to take the ball. Both dynamics that we've spoken about very recently, both shown in one clear shot. The upskilling of the England forwards meant they had the skill sets and the temperament to make these calls, to step in at first receiver if the attack demanded it, and make the plays that would get the attack on the run again. This wasn't the only role that the forwards were limited to, however. Their main other role was operating in the wide channels. In 2013, New Zealand showed just how effective the use of forwards in the wide channels can be. This was shown in their last gasp attack against Ireland in the end of year tour. The forwards were crucial for not only securing possession, but being able to handle the ball effectively like backs and keep the attack on the move. This was considered extremely innovative, and whilst it's probably the best piece of play I have ever seen in my entire life, England were using forwards on the wings back in 2001. Steve Thompson, the hooker, almost filled a Dane Coles type role, being an ex-back row and being very, very proficient in go forward and handling. This was something that was standard because remember, the England back 3 weren't on the wings most of the time. They were close to the ruck at first receiver. As such, someone had to step up, and that came from the England forwards. Richard Hill, Ben Kay, Steve Thompson, it didn't matter. They would fill the role as needed. It also resulted in massive gains because at the wide channels on the defenders, there were usually 10s, 15s and 14s that the forwards are going up against. Therefore, it was a mismatch in England's favour, with Steve Thompson going up against Carlos Spencer here. To finish it all off, we see the England 14 coming in at first to Wilco at second, who makes the killer pass to Lewis Moody, who goes over in the corner. Again, we see all the dynamics that we've talked about illustrated in one clip. A back three player at first, passing to Wilco at second, who uses his footwork and puts the killer pass to the forward on the wing. The man in charge of England's forward pack was Andy Robinson, the former Bath player and former Bath head coach. Whilst Andy wasn't in charge of the line-out or the scrummaging skills, as they had their own separate coaches for that, he was in charge of just their general good forward play. England's forwards were a Rolls-Royce pack. They were a Rolls-Royce pack in every single facet of their play. They had the skills, they had the mentality, and they had the bodies to actually contribute towards this. This, as well as their technical skills, was how a 6-man scrum held out an 8-man All Black scrum on the line. For England, the set piece was an attack, and winning rugby, remember, takes many forms, so they had to be able to execute 15-man rugby, but simultaneously they had to be able to execute 10-man rugby for those grinding games when they needed it. The personalities they had in the pack contributed towards this. Martin Johnson, Lawrence Dallaglio, Trevor Woodman, Steve Thompson, Neil Back, Phil Vickery, all of these guys were captain material and absolutely amazing forwards. What you could then do was take a group of already brilliant forwards and combine them to a team effort, which means that they were able to pull out feats like these line-out drives, which, if we're being perfectly honest, were something that no other team in the world at the time could actually do. It stops so many times here, but each time England reset and just carried on going. The key innovation for England was the use of the Lineout Platform for the set-piece plays. Remember when we discussed that Clive Woodward was very similar to Rob McQueen in his management style? He also took certain elements of the Wallaby game plan under Rob McQueen and applied it to his England side. One of these facets was the use of trick plays off the Lineout Platform. Under McQueen, the Brumbies and the Wallabies were the first teams to actually split the line out into pods, therefore creating a different point of attack. This enabled them to not only think outside the box, but to be able to use the space created to create trick line-out plays that proved very effective. They were that effective that they won the Wallabies the World Cup in 1999. Owen Finnegan's try here all came from a trick play using the tail of the line-out and George Gregan's back pass. It's quite simply classic Brumbies play, but all it is about is varying your point of attack and presenting something different that the defence don't expect to see. Under Woodward, England created very specific and very variable line-out moves, all designed to make targets where you wouldn't expect England to target. They had moves to target the front of the line-out, the tail of the line-out, and even through the middle of the line-out, as you just saw against South Africa. This sort of innovation and trick plays wasn't something expected of England. The Boks, the Wallabies, the All Blacks, yes, that was their forte, but for England it was not expected, yet Clive Woodward changed all of that. He wanted England's attack as well as their defence to be feared, and that is now what we can see. In 1999, one of England's best ever rugby innovators, Brian Ashton, was brought on to the England team. Together with Clive Woodward, before the centenary test in Australia, they spent 4 weeks with England honing the skills, rugby league lines and training movement that they believed would take England's attack to the next level. Brian Ashton is a crazy coach, which is the term for thinking outside the box. Combined with Clive Woodward's philosophies on total rugby, it gave England a huge advantage in their set-piece attack. Together, they came up with a new attacking philosophy that was to take England into the future. This manifested itself as a set of principles that would not only guide England's set-piece attack, but their phase play attack as well. These principles can all be found in basic schoolboy rugby, but when they're executed at the highest level altogether, it basically produced some brilliant performances. These principles turned England into one of the best attacking teams in the world, where flow, momentum and movement were considered paramount. This section, however, is on the set-piece attack, the moves used off the set-piece platform that England were able to score that many first-phase tries from, and the dynamics that helped them in doing this. The names for these moves and the categories are taken from the map that Johnny Wilkinson is seen here describing to his team, exactly the plan on how they plan to attack a particular team and break them down. We have moves like the Wolfie, the Drifter, the World Class, and multiple others. Now I do accept that some of these I may have gotten wrong. If I have, I sincerely apologise to anyone who's in the know, but this is as best as I can physically do. One of the key principles of the England set-piece attack was that the moves used were families of moves, with multiple variations within them. They weren't individual set moves, they were families of moves from which you could launch multiple variations. To give an example, we show you the D2, which is essentially a missed pass to Will Greenwood followed by a pass to Lawrence Dallaglio on the arcing run, targeting the shoulder of the 10. Now against New Zealand, they run this textbook. However, against Ireland, they use the same sequence. They send Will Greenwood up on the M1, except they send Dallaglio around on the arcing run, and he actually does an inside pass to Johnson, and they're able to get the ball away because they were expecting Dallaglio to take the crash. The first move we're going to look at is the brainchild of Brian Ashton, and this move personifies the principle of multiple variations from within one picture and one family of move. This move is the Drifter move. I know the move is called this because originally I confused it with World Class, a variation of the Drifter move that I was told by Johnny Wilkinson that was the move, but I was corrected by Will Greenwood. It is an absolutely sublime move that I see no reason why it still could not work today. Essentially, this strike move is characterised by two ball players, usually Johnny Wilkinson and Will Greenwood, running over two strike runners, usually Ben Cohen and Mike Tindall, who are coming from underneath and from deep to take the ball. This simple shape allows three main attacking options to be delivered from one simple structure. These options are the Drifter Alpha, the Drifter Bravo, and the Drifter Charlie, each combining the 10, the 12, and the 13 channel respectively. The benefits of this move cannot be overstated. The variation, the late decision making, all is on offer because of the flatness and the alignments that are involved within this move. If the defence drifts to cover the ball players, the drift presents weak inside shoulders to the strike runners. If the defence holds to mark the strike runners, there is space out wide for the ball players. Combined that the decision can be made at any point during the move, and what it simply does is presents the defence with too many options and too many confusing decisions to be made at any one moment in time. Now, we're going to start getting into these moves. We're going to start with the Drifter Alpha, which is intended to target the 10 channel, but the key thing to note is at any one point, any of these options can be picked at any one time until the last second. Just keep that in mind, because that is the very essence of this move. Now, the Drifter Alpha is designed to put Ben Cohen, one of England's strongest carriers, against the 10, and that is what Ben Cohen was brilliant at. Ben Cohen was England's power winger. He was simply a freight train, a 16-stone slab of muscle who could run the 100 in just over 10 seconds and outskin Doug Howlett. Basically, he was not the bloke you ever want to see running down your channel, especially if you are a 10, and that is exactly where this move was intended to send Ben Cohen, down the 10 channel. Fly halves are generally not considered the best tacklers. This leads to defensive coaches actually trying to hide 10s in their defensive system to avoid them being targeted because it is usually a very easy gain in meters if you do. Johnny Wilkinson was the exception to this, but he was the exception rather than the rule. See, England would send Ben Cohen up the 10 channel to break the line and get on the front foot, therefore getting momentum and being able to put the wide men in for hopefully a try or a massive break. You see, the real mastery of this, however, is how they would isolate the 10. Johnny Wilkinson only drifts out a little bit, so he interests the attention of the 12, meaning Ben Cohen gets a one-on-one with the 10, making the break and getting behind the South African line. The reason this was so effective in this occasion was because of flat play and the late decision making at the line. We'll show you two examples now from the spring tour of 2003. Against Australia, the pass by Johnny here is given quite a few metres behind the gain line, meaning Ben Cohen is well marked. Earlier on in the game, however, a key try is scored using this move, but if we have a look at the delivery of the pass, look how much flatter Johnny Wilkinson is to the line when he gives it. Will Greenwood runs exactly the same line, however Ben Cohen receives the pass as he is basically already going through the gap, and that is the only difference between the success of the move and the failure of the move. Wilkinson does perform a really good double pump that disguises the true ball carrier. However, when Cohen takes this ball, he is on a line that is so flat and so powerful that there is no one that is going to stop him. This resulted in one of Ben Cohen's best tries possibly of his international career, and at this point, it put the game beyond doubt. The Drifter Bravo was a move designed to put the second ball carrier or the second strike runner into the 12/13 channel. This was usually performed by Mike Tindall or Josh Lucy, depending on the configuration. This strike runner still had a ball player drifting over him, therefore drawing out the defence and allowing the short pass to put him straight into the hole and get on the offensive. The change in angles and the numbers of variations within this confused the defences that came up against it, and it's why it was a perfect brainchild and a perfect embodiment of what Brian Ashton stood for. We can see a perfect example of targeting weak shoulders here. The defence starts drifting to cover the ball players, and instead they therefore present a weak shoulder to the ball carrier. In this case, the role being performed by Dan Luger, who makes a significant break. In essence, the move is essentially an M1 followed by a short pop pass. That is all it is, but because of the lines involved in it, it confuses defences, and that is what it's intended to do. In this case, a good read means Luger gets absolutely nailed, and rightly so, because he ran down a very strong channel. But when the move is used effectively and the defence by the ball players drift, the ball carrier is then presented with very weak shoulders from which he can crash through, and using support play can score first phase tries like this. Remember, first phase tries are a key objective of the England attack, and that's because first phase tries mean support play is operating at a very good level. Very rarely will a strike runner who makes a break get to the line in the same phase. He needs support, and that is what England and Clive Woodward were drilled, because Clive Woodward wanted to make sure one break meant one try, and they did that to the best of their abilities. Now, England knew that defences would be accounting for their strike plays, and therefore they were able to make changes in line and variation within the play to actually target certain defenders or if they saw an opening. This attitude confused the defence even more because this ad hoc change in line wasn't part of the plan, and as such it was just them playing what they saw, which is why it was very hard to contain. Now, the final variation of the drifter move was the Charlie option, to target the 13 channel and basically move the ball out wide. Basically, this was 2 M1s in one. This was incredibly effective if the defence held for the strike runners. Basically, the ball would be passed to Johnny Wilkinson, who would use Mike Tyndall's decoy to pass over to Will Greenwood, who would unleash the wide men. In this Drifter Bravo option, we actually see the Drifter Charlie option not taken, and it would have been the right option. It would have shot Will Greenwood straight into the 13 channel because the opposition 13 had actually held to account for the strike runner. Thereby, the drift option, or the ball player, was the right call. In this case, a Drifter Charlie option is run when a Drifter Bravo option was the right call. The defence had drifted to account for the ball player, and Ben Cohen would have gone through on the weak shoulders. Later on, we see the same move run, and with a little bit of offloading and skill, the move does come off, and England get to the wide channels and make quite a significant break. However, this is all down to late decision making. As we've said, it is basically 2 M1s in a row. However, with the change in angle and line, the defence don't know whether to stick or where to drift, and therefore, that enhances the potential of the players finding space. The strike runner does not have to be chosen until the very last second, and that means the defence have far less time to make the judgment and make the right call. I believe eventually we will see this move make a comeback. That's because this move was originally replaced with the league slice option, the standard second line attack shape that is used by most teams now in World Rugby. There are benefits to this shape over the standard league attack shape, as we will show you later, and Will Greenwood agrees, so I'm going to go with it. However, there is no denying that due to the alignment and the speed and the late decision making that this can be run at, it is a very, very effective move. The second move that we're going to look at is the split hit and the split miss. In a way, these are quite similar to the drifter, with it basically being a drift option off a second receiver. The deciding back in this case is the 12, with the 10 actually being a distributor and making sure that the ball gets to the 12. After this, the 12 then has the option of the split hit or the split miss, depending on what is on. The split hit is basically the alpha option of the drift portion, and it targets the 12 channel. This is the option that was run against New Zealand and also the option that was run against France here, with Ben Cohen taking it up in the split hit. The split miss, however, targets the 13 channel. And a perfect example of this was in the quarter-final against Wales in 2003. Wilkinson passes to Mike Catt, who puts a miss pass into Will Greenwood, who manages to get the ball out to Mike Tyndall, straight into the 13 channel and making a massive break. Again, for me, this brings home the advantage of the drifter over the slice option. In the drifter, the second that the ball is passed, there are 2 viable options here. The defence do not know which option the ball is going to go to, and in this case it goes to Will Greenwood on the split miss. In contrast, with the league slice option, the second the pass is given, you know who the ball's going to, and that gives the drifter a huge advantage over the slice. In this move also, the positioning of the second receiver is essential for the variation that this move can have. Here, we have Mike Catt, who has almost drifted over to make a tunnel option in between the split hit and the split miss option. The reasoning behind this is that the second receiver can launch a tunnel pass in between the split miss and the split hit option to a back free player coming from deep. Now in this case, the split miss is chosen, and the tunnel pass option to Josh Lucy doesn't happen. In this case, however, the option is different. Greenwood passes to Wilco, who makes the killer pass in between the split hit and split miss options to Ben Cohen, who goes in with Jason Robinson. Again, the moves get fancier and fancier, but the principle always remains the same. It is the same picture with the multiple variations that each of them can be picked as late as possible. Now the next move that we're going to look at is called Missile Carry. It's intended to target the 10 channel and the tail cunner/10 gap off lineout. Now one thing that we need to note from here is whilst the names of Drifter and the split hit and the split miss are accurate and we're 100% sure those are the names of those moves, from here on out it's not entirely sure that Missile Carry actually means this move or World Class means that move, so on and so forth. However, we're going to use these as the names fit best with the description. Missile Carry is essentially a move where a runner comes in short and hard off the first receiver to target the 10 channel. It is quite popular off set piece and in phase play, as we'll look at later. In a way, this attack was very similar to the Warren Ball attack that was popularised by Wales in the Warren Gatland era of Jamie Roberts at 12. The principle was very similar to what England did in 2001-2002. Jamie Roberts, a very powerful carrier, would go down the 10 channel and make the break. Missile Carry was very, very similar. They used it repeatedly in the World Cup final as it was sent to target big runners down the 10 channel and get the guys on the front foot. Once front foot ball had been achieved, the ball would be shipped out wide, with a backline and boys ready there waiting to take the ball and hopefully make as much ground as possible. England's continuity in this attack was thoroughly dependent on the use of forward support for the offload. Remember, this attack targets the 10 channel and the tail gunner gap off lineout. That means that forwards are often the closest in support for the offload, and they repeatedly fulfilled this role in many, many occasions. This showed just how keen Clive Woodward was to maintain the continuity in the attack, maintain momentum, because they'd always insist on having support options, usually in Lawrence Dallaglio, on the inside for this move. This move not only set up the position for Johnny Wilkinson to kick his field goal in extra time that won England the World Cup, but they used it repeatedly in phase play as well. Here the ball goes to kaput and Mike Tyndall goes back to join the killer group, as we'll discuss later. The ball is recycled and goes forward just to gain time. When the ball was eventually recycled and shipped out to the back line, it's shipped out to James Simpson-Daniel, a 14, who puts Ben Cohen in on the missile carry, going straight up the guts and winning a try that would win England the game. Now, the next play we're going to look at is the World Class play. A variation of Drifter, it's designed to target the 13 channel with a shielding of the strike runner. Now the main difference in this move is that instead of the ball player running over one strike runner, the ball player actually runs over two strike runners. He receives the pass and then puts through a strike runner coming from deep straight into the 13 channel. What makes this move is the second receiver's screening of the strike runner. By committing the 13, he inadvertently draws the 13 to him and opens the 13 channel for the strike runner to shoot straight into. We see the exact same principle against Wales, with Greenwood committing Mark Taylor and putting Mike Tyndall into the gap, and therefore making the huge break. This move relies on the same principle. Greenwood commits the French 13, putting Cohen into the gap. Admittedly, this time it doesn't work, but we can see what they're trying to do. It's all about multiple variations and late decision making at the line. I know I keep reiterating this, but it is about that. We see the same move run with Greenwood at first receiver. However, he doesn't pick the option that was expected. He picks another option because they are always on the cards. Again, a few families of moves with countless variations to keep that defense guessing. Next up, we want to introduce you to that second phase platform, or the D2 that we spoke about earlier, with Lawrence Dallaglio coming round on that arcing run. This move, of course, like all England moves, had its variations, yet it started with Will Greenwood on the M1 from the scrum half. As a refresher, we'll show you the New Zealand example. The M1 goes out to Greenwood, but is followed up with the arcing run from Dallaglio on second phase. Dallaglio's involvement in this move is exactly what the move is all about. Lawrence Dallaglio is more than just the player who inspired the look of Jack Reacher and the Lee Child novels. Dallaglio's role as a primary line breaker at 8 was inspired. He was a behemoth, and as such he could score tries that not many other 8s could do. However, in my personal opinion, Dallaglio's best position was at 6. It was a blindside. It wasn't at 8, it was at 6. As shown in this much more modern game, the 6 isn't a primary line breaker. He's actually a guy who comes round on the second wave of the attack. Usually you get an 8, a 12 or a 13 who are the primary line breakers off first phase, but on second phase it's the 6. Why is this important? This is important because the move was developed to take use of Lawrence Dallaglio's strengths at blindside flanker, where he wasn't a primary line breaker, but he more preferred coming through on that second wave to target the inside shoulder of the 10 and get on the forward momentum. This sequence play was very, very simple, but it was very, very effective, and this is because it had one main role: to train the defence. You can bet, in the lead up to England test matches, opposition defensive coaches would have been telling their players to watch out for this move. They would have analysed it and said, watch out for Dallaglio on second phase. In the quarter-final against Wales, we see a variation. There's a drift alpha to hit the 10 channel, followed by Dallaglio on the second phase on that arcing run. Now he's targeting the 12 in this case, and the Blindside has come along to help. England therefore set the danger for Dallaglio on the second phase for Wales, and 18 minutes later, they cash in. They launch the attack with the same framework but different sequence. They throw the M1 to Greenwood, and as per the sequence, they're expecting, as we can see the 6 looking here, over for Dallaglio. They're expecting Dallaglio on this second phase. But this is where the use of variation in this move really comes to play. The 6 is still occupying Dallaglio, but the pass doesn't go to Dallaglio, it goes to Wilco. Wilco is much flatter and much wider out, which means he can get round the 6 and get England on the front foot. England also used this move against Eddie O'Sullivan's Ireland in 2003 in the Six Nations. England run the M1 to Greenwood and he takes it up the 10 channel. However, if we have a look here, Wilco is actually looking back to his forwards and reorganising the second phase variation because he's seen a weakness. He clearly sees something on the fringes because he sends 3 forwards in with the inside pass of Dallaglio, who's attracted 2 men to Johnson, with Kay coming through for the offload. The principle behind this was there were always variations on the second phase. On this occasion, it's actually Richard Hill who comes in on the arcing run for second receiver, but this is because the pass is actually going out wide and he's a considerably better passer than Dallaglio. The premise behind this, however, was England made Dallaglio the danger man. They made defences watch out for him, and as such, variations around this move could find weaknesses because they overcommitted to Dallaglio. Even if the move broke down or it didn't go exactly as planned, there was enough flexibility and variation in it to keep the move on the run, as we can see in the World Cup final. The M1 didn't happen here as the move broke down, however England have noticed the danger. The 10, 12 and the back row are currently occupied in this ruck, meaning there are numbers out wide. England used Dallaglio on the arcing run, he targets Mortlock and passes inside to Wilco, who then gets the pass out to Jason Robinson, which scores England's only try in the World Cup final. As such, England owe a lot to this move. The next move is what I've termed as the Nike 2, and it made use of Mike Tindall, England's outside centre, even though he wore 12 because Greenwood wore 13 for lucky reasons. Mike Tindall was one of England's main strike runners. He actually operated with the forwards in the killer groups, as we'll show later, but he was very powerful and very, very good at breaking the line. This move made use of this strength combined with a change in angle from Tindall to strike the 12/13 channel. Essentially, it was a pass from Wilco who would run under Greenwood, and Greenwood would actually launch a short pass to Tindall, coming in on a change of angle to really make the break. The change in angle from Tindall was what actually made this move. You see, Greenwood and Wilkinson both take the ball very flat to the line, thereby committing the 10-12. Therefore, the change in angle is meant to exploit the 12-13 channel. Wales deal with this very well, with the 10 acting as a catch-up defender and pushing the 12 out to cover the 13 line. But against Australia, we see Tindall make quite a big break using this. You see, what this really relies on is the ball watching of the opposition 13. Ball watching is quite dangerous in defence because you can miss what the attack are doing in front of you. Tindall's target here is the 12-13 channel, and because of the actions of Grayson and Greenwood, he goes straight through on the flat line. Tindall's change in line means he goes straight through on this channel, and it's all down to Brian O'Driscoll's ball watching. We can see it here. O'Driscoll is following the play rather than looking at what's in front of him and looking at Tindall's change in line. The result?
Oh shit.
Tindall goes straight through because Brian O'Driscoll can't close the space in time because he was ball watching. One of the sexiest rugby plays of all time, if all modern times at least, is actually based on this principle combined with the offload. The All Blacks Javelin is designed to target the 13 channel with an offload from Sonny Bill Williams. Sonny Bill goes through, and because the Scottish winger again is ball watching, Mackenzie's change in line remains unnoticed. He goes straight through the 13 channel and eventually makes the break where he passes to Barrett, who goes in for the try. It is a very simple play, but because of ball watching, it means it can be very, very effective. And this is one move that England used repeatedly throughout their World Cup campaign. Now, obviously there are more moves. England didn't just have 6 moves. That wasn't the case. There was the DA, there was Wolfie, there was a couple of others. However, that isn't as important as what comes next. You see, Woodward took a great deal of IP and knowledge from Rob McQueen, especially in the 2001 Lions tour, whom he basically roomed with during the Lions tour of Australia. They often had very similar moves to Rob McQueen's Australia, and more importantly, they also copied some of the facets of his Brumby's play. They weren't strictly copying, they actually developed their own style of play based on tenets that weren't only Brumby's but also taken from his time in Manly when he was a player. Brumby's style play, however, was very physical and very abrasive, but also very, very hard to stop once it got going. Basically, the Brumbies and the Wallabies would pick a 5 to 10 metre channel around the fringes of the ruck, and they would send their forwards and their hard-running back three at it again and again and again with speed and aggression. Pick and goes, inside balls, they would continually attack this channel. Eventually, once they made the break, they would then move the ball out wide for the try. It was very smart, but also very effective, and would eventually lead to the precursor that formed the killer groups under Clive Woodward. The main reason that we bring the Brumbies up here, however, is that England used a lot of their philosophies to keep the ball on the go and keep the attack on the move. This was particularly true with Neil Back. You see, those rapid-fire pick-and-goes that we talked about, where the second that the ball was down on the ground you had a support carrier coming straight through, picking and going and challenging the fringe defence. That was standard England play off set-piece. If England had made gain line on first phase, that meant there would usually be space for the rapid-fire pick-and-go, and this is something that they used repeatedly throughout the World Cup campaign as well as leading from the 2001 up until 2003. Although we see Neil Back doing it on the previous two occasions, it didn't have to be Neil Back. It could be Dan Luger, it could be a centre, because the principle of momentum overweighed who the hell picked the ball up. This was all about momentum. If Neil Back would take 3 seconds to get to the ruck and the gap was going to close in 1 second, they didn't care. They had to go immediately to make use of it, and that is why the number on the back didn't matter. When it was effective, it was incredibly, incredibly, incredibly effective. And that was what England wanted to keep doing. They wanted to keep the foot on the throat, and it wasn't just limited to pick and goes. It also wasn't just limited to second phase action. Whenever they had the momentum, they could employ this. They also targeted the fringes in other ways. Not only did they use the pick and goes, but they also used the back three players targeting the fringes. This fit in very well with England's philosophy of back three players operating at first receiver, with Josh Lucy making break here against Ireland and later on against New Zealand. Against New Zealand, we see a standard split miss happen, and whilst you expect maybe on the second phase for the pick and go to happen, instead they switch over to Jason Robinson because they want Jason Robinson operating against forwards, because he is far more likely to make that break. The Brumbies and Wallabies also had a habit of using back passes and long inside balls to target the fringes of the ruck, with forwards and back three players targeting this area. England also employed this philosophy, mainly on set piece, but they also used it in phase play, as we can see Will Greenwood making a fantastic line here to eventually score a try that puts England 2 scores ahead. They also became very prevalent in the use of the back passes as well. Matt Dawson was clearly instructed in this technique because you can see him basically being George Gregan and passing back to Ben Kay to keep the attack funneled around the fringes. We see it against France, and we also see it against Georgia, where after the break is made, the continuity to offload and carry on going is prevalent. This is classic Rob McQueen play, and is something that we've taken from them. Next up, we need to talk about the use of England's support runners. In every move that England ran off set piece, they had dedicated support runners who would come through hard with the strike runner to make sure that the attack would continue. Against Ireland in the Nike 2, it's Josh Lucy. We can see he sprints through with Tyndall and is actually on his shoulder when he goes over the try line. Against Wales, we see Tyndall go through on the Bravo line and Will Greenwood, Charlie, becomes the support runner for him. England's philosophy was constant support. Once their strike runners or back three got behind the line, they would slow down or even run sideways to allow the support to catch up with them. This came in the form of CT runners, or coming through runners. You see this philosophy in so much of England's attack off set piece and off phase play as well. Even when the ball carrier goes to ground, you get a CT runner coming through, as shown here in Richard Hill, to continue the attack. This is the philosophy behind the forward support on the missile carry and every strike move that England run. They need to make sure that the attack can be continued after the line break has been made. It is brilliant off the ball work, and it's all because the support runner expects the break. The late positioning that a lot of the setups in the England attack involve means they expect the strike runner to make the break. We see a perfect example of this against Australia with Ben Cohen's score. Look at Josh Lucy and Jason Robinson here. They are sprinting, and they are sprinting to get through with Ben Cohen. That means when he makes his break, they actually end up on his shoulder when he goes over the try line. This principle was not just set piece, it was in phase play and it was in everything that England did in attack. They were always trying to keep the attack on the move, and that is why England was so shit hot on this. The next really common thing that we see off set piece with England, and this was off the scrum, was a blindside raid. England's strike runners always aimed to hit the line flat and hard. That meant that they would make breaks, and therefore they would not want the opposition back row screwing up those breaks once they'd been taken down. Therefore, England regularly used Lawrence Dallaglio or one of their wingers to step or to make ground on the blindside, thereby committing the back row and ensuring that they weren't available to source the rucks on the next phase. If we have a look here, look at how many of the back row are brought over. From this simple run, 3 of New Zealand's back row have been committed to literally a 2-metre channel. Thereby, they are not able to act on the rucks if England go wide on the next phase. We see a prime example of this in England's quarter-final against Wales. Lawrence Dallaglio goes over to the blind and commits all 3 of the back row. As we know, the split miss is then run and Tyndall goes into the 13 channel, and he makes a very, very, very significant break. However, because the back row haven't been able to get over, the quick ball is something that England get and they're able to run with it. They also used Jason Robinson for this, because Jason Robinson can step someone in a phone box. Trust me, I know. But again, he manages to commit the entire New Zealand back row in one single channel, and against Uruguay, he's so damn good that he manages to get round them and then make a magnificent break because, well, he's Jason Robinson. Now, I do need to re-emphasise, none of this is mind-blowing rugby. None of it is magical, none of it is overly revolutionary. All it is the simple schoolboy basics done very, very well. Now that that's the set piece done and dusted, it's time now for us to move on to the multi-phase attack. Now, England's multi-phase attack was a combination of the rugby brains of Brian Ashton and Clive Woodward, put together and then going to absolute town. Brian's influence came before the 1999 centenary test, where he was with England for 4 weeks in Australia. During his time, he focused on movement, stoppages and set piece. However, movement was the key thing that he taught when he was with England. This was because England had one very simple goal. Their primary goal, which combined with Clive Woodward, was very simple in their attack: to exhaust the opposition. Contrary to popular belief, England were a very, very, very fit team, and this was their main objective in their attack. Much like a boxer leaning on another, they could use their 10-man style rolling maul to sap the opposition forward pack, but this wasn't enough for them. They developed a couple of patterns of play, each of them designed to target particular areas and designed to target in different ways. However, all of them were meant to exhaust the opposition. The first pattern we're going to look at is England's SMART pattern, also known as the killer attack. Essentially, the SMART pattern was comprised of punch groups that were located within and around the 15 metres. These punch groups had both forwards and backs in them, and you would get a varying number of players within them. Originally, I was convinced there had to be a set number of forwards and a set number of backs assigned to them. So I actually went through and started looking at multiple games and started looking at different killer sets. They had sometimes forwards in the wide channels, sometimes all the forwards close up, sometimes they had only one forward out there, sometimes they had like every other forward like 4 and 4. It was a complete and utter mess. You see, as an analyst and as a player, we are very conditioned for structure now. 1-3-3-1, 2-4-2, 2-2-3-1, all these different structures that you get are now expected and an established part of the game. However, as I looked at these different killer groups, I saw a varying number of forwards in them in particular, and also a varying number of backs, and it made no sense because there should be a set number. But then I had a webinar with Brian Ashton's company Inspired Coaching, and it became clear across all patterns the forward assignments were fluid. It wasn't about strict numbers like 2-4-2 or 1-3-3-1s. It was about using intelligence and resourcing the rucks accordingly, dependent on the pattern in play. To give you an example of this, let's take a look at Steve Thompson. Steve Thompson was the England hooker who was a converted back row, and he was usually positioned on the wings. He was fast and he was very, very powerful, so therefore it was a natural fit on the wing, because he was great in mismatches and great at getting go forward. We see his positioning here against Australia, against New Zealand, against Wales, so it was not an isolated occurrence. He was commonly found here, and as such, it was something that he was very, very structurally intended to do. However, if we have a look here, we can see him in the quarter-final at the bottom of the screen. The ball goes out, and a phase later, he actually finds himself at first receiver, trucking it up the centre, so he has changed his entire position. Against Ireland in 2003, we see him in the centre trucking it up, not on the wing but on the centre, and he's varied his role many times during this game. This variety in where the forwards were assigned on the field meant it wasn't like pre-assigned on their structure, rather they were using their own game intelligence to source the rucks within the demands of what pattern they were playing. This is the difference between the structure of today and the coaching of Brian Ashton. The coaching of Brian Ashton meant forwards used their own initiative and their own intelligence to decide where they needed to be. And this was the case for the SMART pattern. The SMART pattern depended on 3 things to work: power and momentum, handling and offloading, and very, very good footwork. We can see the first example of the killer pattern against New Zealand in 2003. Essentially, what is going on is there's multiple cases of forwards and backs all congregating towards the 15-metre channel. Once they're here, they use a combination of their power, their ball carriers, and footwork and handling to get on the front foot. And that is what they are continually trying to do, get on the front foot in this channel. The reason they're trying to do this is because when they are actually going up in killer fashion, they're going up and trucking up in the 15-metre channel. This leaves an entire open side which can be used in many ways for England to strike. Once they're on the front foot, it is very, very difficult to stop them, because not only are they attacking with pace and speed, but they've got very, very heavy ball carriers going after the same tacklers. This means the same set of defenders are having to make tackle after tackle after tackle, whereas England are recycling their numbers because they have more numbers in this point. It is essentially old-fashioned Sun Tzu, and that is all there is to it. What they do is you get a lot of players, or a lot of England players, you target them against a specific point of the Welsh line in this case, and that specific point of the Welsh line may have only 4 or 5 defenders in it, so you are targeting 5 defenders with 4 attackers. This is also a very smart style of play, hence the moniker, because what you're doing is you're consistently keeping numbers around the breakdown. Therefore, you have a lot of numbers around the breakdown, meaning you can resource the rucks very effectively, and therefore you're very unlikely to be turned over. If we have a look here, look how many numbers are contained within the 15-metre channel for England. There is an exorbitant amount of players there, and they are making go forward. That is quite evident to see from the way that they're going. You have wingers in there, but remember the old England ethos and what they're trying to do. You can have wingers who can play as flankers. That is expected in the England attacking system, and they are doing that. This tactic is not only intended to win go forward and keep the pressure on the opposition, but it is intended to exhaust the opposition as well. Once they've made ground here, they then have a full backline that they can quickly use to actually exploit any point on the field, especially if they've dragged men over into the 15-metre channel. But above all else, the defenders here are growing more and more exhausted, which in the long run is exactly what England want for their other patterns. Here, let's have a look at a killer opportunity from Ireland in 2003. As we can see, all of the forwards and all the backs are now starting to move over to the blindside, to the 15-metre channel. Wilkinson and Robinson combine with footwork and offloading to get England on the front foot, after which they then get the ball to their ball carriers, starting to move forward slowly. As we can see, there is not a chance for Ireland to contest this ball. There are too many numbers for England, and they are clearing out and resourcing the rucks very, very effectively. They manage to get the ball to Jason Robinson, who again, using sensational footwork, gets England on the front foot, after which you have Lawrence Dallaglio coming down off a short pass. Outside of the killer group, we can start to see the backline organising, with Will Greenwood at first and Johnny Wilkinson at second receiver for the killer pass. Greenwood sets a drift out alpha option, with Neil back as the alpha strike runner. Greenwood actually doesn't run that option. He takes it up himself when the ball's recycled and it's passed quickly out to Josh Lucy. Knowing the importance of speed, Lucy gets it out to the backline where it eventually goes out to Ben Kay, who's on the wing. This was a brilliant way to exhaust the opposition, but the next pattern was an absolute specialist for this, and that is the slide and switch pattern. Before we can really go into the nitty-gritty parts of this pattern, we have to show you something, and that is how many times England seem to have half or more than half their team on one side of the pitch. In fact, sometimes you get up to 13 men located within one half of the pitch. This is the result of switching between the switch and slide pattern and the killer pattern, as we'll shortly see. See, what we need to understand is the use of midfield stacks within the slide and switch pattern. These stacks are simply combinations of players in the midfield, all of which have 3 main purposes. Firstly, we need to start on the pass to break. The pass to break are basically catch and pass sets in the midfield, where forwards will combine with flat passes to try and get them through the line and someone to make a break. They are of incredible importance, particularly in the slide pattern. There will usually be a playmaker in here, but what the English are trying to do is catch and pass and draw players in so that eventually someone can make a break through these huge gaps that are being created. This midfield stack is pretty common. We've seen it against Ireland, we've seen it against Australia, and all the time they're trying to take the ball flat and trying to put one of their carriers through the gap. One of these carriers is always taking an out-to-in line. That out-to-in lines from the ball carrier are very important because what the inside men are doing is creating space. They're drawing in the defence, and therefore the out-to-in line is the most important and the best chance of making this break. These midfield stacks followed the England ethos of flat passing and the ball carrier hitting the line hard, as well as some of them actually having moves. Remember, the England mantra was the number on your back doesn't matter. That's why we see England forwards actually doing a split miss option to get the ball out wide. The handling in this and the running lines used were absolutely exceptional, but remember, the England forwards were always trying to run an out-to-in line because they wanted the defence to jam in on them, and this was very useful for the slide. You see, as we can see against Samoa, a pass-to-break midfield set is set up and Johnny Wilkinson passes to it. Now there's interplay and the forwards get on the front foot and the forwards have to come in the defensive line. This means there is space out wide to attack, and Catt comes in with Wilco at second receiver, however he misses out and passes to Phil Vickery, who goes over. The question is, how did that happen? You see, the secret to the slide pattern is that when the break is actually made, it drags in defenders. However, Catt, Johnny Wilkinson and Steve Thompson are currently aligning over to the blindside. This means that when the ball goes out, there is a mismatch and also numbers for England. As such, this results in Phil Vickery going over, and it was a 2-on-2 that became a 4-on-2 because England were proactive in reloading round the corner. Against Wales in the quarter-final, we see something similar. Jason Robinson comes in at first and he actually gets two forwards on the inside who swing round to make sure they can offer themselves as options. The key thing to remember is your stack makes the break, which draws in their defenders whilst your attackers fold round the corner, meaning you gain numbers on the far side. We see a perfect example where a 13-man England are able to gain space on a 15-man All Black squad. Phil Vickery comes in for the killer and the stack is set up with Greenwood at first and Johnny Wilkinson at second. Wilkinson picks the killer pass at second to Martin Johnson, coming in on that out-to-in line. Because of this line, he draws in the outside All Black defenders. Now England have moved over Josh Lucy and Will Greenwood, meaning England have numbers on the far side. This pattern causes opposition teams to run, and run very, very fast to try and catch up with the extending England line. Against South Africa, the pass to Stackpod puts Jason Leonard through, but he gets the ball away, and in the same phase, you now have multiple players overloading a side that South Africa don't have numbers. In reality, it is a very simple pattern. It's nothing complicated, but it takes an extraordinary amount of fitness to do this. Against Ireland, England use a twin set to get the ball wide, but as we can see, when the ball goes to ground, you're not setting up a killer set, they're setting up a slide set, with Lawrence Dallaglio and Josh Lucy going around the corner. They would actually usually set to killer set, and it is available, however they send the ball to Steve Thompson who goes midfield. The slide is still on, as we can see, England players are flying over to the other side at a rate of knots. This means Wilkinson has inside options, which means the inside defence can't drift, and means with a bit of footwork he can get through a gap and start offloading and start the England attacking pattern again. Now, we've discussed the slide pattern, but what we really need to get into now is the switch and where this links up with the slide in its own way. The switch came about because England wanted an option to target this highlighted area, the opposite side of the fringes. The result was the flashlight. Flashlight was a call that was used to target the excessive overfold round the fringes, or, alternatively, it could be used to reuse another attacking line. If the option wasn't on for the short side, Johnny Wilkinson, as can be seen here, switches over. This allows him to exploit the open side, which, as we can see, is far more exploitable and far more right option than the blind side was. Basically, it allows them to switch the side of the attack and use a different line, especially if this line has an overlap. And if anyone tells you that this pattern wouldn't have a use today, you can tell them to come and suck my It works. You can see against Australia, England make massive gains using a twin set on an open side that was considerably more exploitable than the blind side they had. Essentially, what they were doing was switching the side of the attack using a rapid receiver, and then they were able to take advantage either of an overlap, or they could send Jason Robinson straight up the guts of the fringe defence, which, as you can imagine, he is very, very effective at. Jason Robinson, in particular, was perfect for this because he had acceleration like no other rugby player on this planet I have ever seen, and probably ever will see if I'm honest. He was sent in particular to target the fringes, and there's a particular reason why, because the league-based system always coaches an overfold of the fringes. Against Australia, you can see England send a set of forwards at the opposite fringe to the one being targeted to ensure they don't fold over. Against Wales, they do exactly the same thing to ensure Johnny has the option to target the fringes if it was on. There is another method they use, but the key thing to remember before we show this is that set piece often translates to phase play and vice versa. England have run of drifter alpha here on the first phase, but the key thing I want you to take note of is Josh Lucy moving over from the outside channels over to this way. England recycle the ball, the ball goes out on second phase to Josh Lucy, who has come round and targets the fringes on this side. In phase play, the setup is the same, but Jason Robinson is in the wide channels. Richie McCaw has folded over to the far side, and this was a mistake. This is the trigger for the switch pattern, and it's what England have been waiting for. Jason Robinson targets the fringe, and McCaw hasn't got back in time, allowing him to make the break necessary to get England on the front foot. Because of Robinson's speed, he got through whilst McCaw was still out of position. At worst, you get weak shoulders with this. At best, you get numbers and a potential overlap. That is the variety of this pattern. It gives you two targets. One of them is numbers, because you're actually reusing a line where you have more numbers than the opposition. The other is the fold. You are banking on numbers folding over. Therefore, the side that you're switching to, you have more numbers than the opposition, but on top of that, their fringe will be undermanned, meaning you can go through if you have a fast enough first receiver. This and the slide pattern were almost the default for England. England would go to the centre of the field, and from there they'd be able to work out which side of the field was more or less numbered, and they could strike accordingly. Constantly switching between these meant the defence didn't know what to do. Mentally they were getting tired, physically they were getting tired, and constantly England were therefore achieving their goal, exhausting the opposition, creating mismatches, and remaining unpredictable. This is what Brian Ashton was all about, and it was very, very effective. However, there had to be some key structure, and that is exemplified by the Twins midfield stack. The Twins midfield stack was essentially two two-man pods, each pod having a playmaker to run it. It was a structure designed to stretch the defence but also hold them, because you had the threat of four very good ball carriers coming straight at the line at you. It was, however, a set designed to stretch the defence, which is why the ball often went through the ball players, and then the ball players would pick whichever forward they wanted to pass the ball to. The majority of the time it was made up of forwards. However, remember England's number on the back philosophy. The number on the back doesn't matter, which is why there were backs and centres who often got involved in the Twins setup. These pods also would be able to operate the drifter option if it was needed, and also they could run other lines like the split miss and split hit as well. It was a very common setup in England's wide philosophy, with each ball player having two forwards they could pass to, and therefore multiple options within the line. One thing to note, however, is that the philosophy always came over structure. Against South Africa in this example, there's no twin setup, there's no pass to break setup, there's basically two wide playmakers, and that is it. That is all England have to move wide. You see, when England want to move the ball wide, they go through two playmakers. Phil Christophers operates at first here for the pod as is protocol, but when they move wide, Wilkinson and Greenwood both combine to get the ball wide. Wilkinson has passed to Greenwood, however, and therefore Greenwood can do godlike things and basically score tries like this, and then, to make himself even cooler, looks up the TMO and just goes, yep, you know, that's a try, that's a good try. The principle was, however, when England were moving wide, they didn't really care for structure or league lines or anything like that. They instead just went through two playmakers. They had multiple playmakers in their side, so therefore they weren't short of options. Against Wales, they consistently moved the ball wide through two playmakers, Wilkinson, Greenwood, and also Hodgson in this case, but that is what they're consistently doing. Two playmakers who can catch and pass the ball and therefore distribute as they see fit. The twin playmakers set is quite common today, except it usually operates behind league lines and league shapes. England, however, always passed in front of the line, therefore ensuring they could play flat and get the ball wide quickly. Sometimes getting into structures can take time. Structure is never as important as the principle, and nor should it hamper it. England believed you had to get the ball wide quickly. It didn't have to be pretty, you just had to get it through two playmakers and get it to the areas where it would hurt the opposition the most. The forwards weren't just decoy options, they were catch and pass options. Jason Robinson at first, Wilco at second, Jason Leonard at third, and out to Lucy and then Luger. That is exactly what England were all about. Multiple players who could operate at first, forwards who could handle like backs, that is what Jim Greenwood had honed in Clive Woodward, and it's what Clive Woodward then went on to hone in his England players. Now, the last pattern we're going to talk about today is quite a short category, I'm not going to lie. The split pattern is basically kind of what you get when you do a slide and switch, but you don't start folding over or you don't start coming back this way. It's essentially what happens when you hit up the midfield pod, but you maintain equal numbers on both sides, and each side has a playmaker who can slot in as first receiver, and each of whom can run their side of the field effectively. As we can see here, no numbers really fold over. Instead, the rock is resourced, and then you've got Jason Robinson on the near side and Johnny Wilkinson on the far side, and it's all dependent on which side they want to use to attack. Both lines are up very flat. They all have carriers that can take the ball at pace straight up the guts and hit the line, and therefore they can bend the line to actually get space on the far side. This pattern is essentially about maintaining numbers in the centre of the field. That way you can split the field in two sides and you can pick whichever line you want. It's thoroughly dependent on the situation, how many numbers, and so on and so forth, but essentially that's what it's all about. Now, that's all the patterns handled. That's all the patterns talked about, discussed, and if you're feeling like this, don't worry too much, because we're going to go into how you switch and the decision making within these patterns. If you made it here in one sitting, I do not envy you. I understand your brain must be absolutely shattered right now. However, we're just going to go through a couple of things that really bring this all together. Remember what I said at the start, that England's culture was certainly their best asset. That there is what drove everything, and it also drove their leadership. This leadership was what they needed in order to switch between their patterns off their own accord. Don't go to a game plan, they knew exactly how they would switch and what they needed to do, particular for each opponent. They understood that they would have to use their own initiative to switch between patterns as the space appeared on the field. And that is what we're going to be looking at now. We are going to show you how they switch between patterns and how they do this to keep pressure always on the opposition. First on the docket for the breakdown is France. We start off with a first phase alpha option to target the 10 and they go forward. Now the second phase is the Brumby play that we actually discussed earlier. England make a little bit of go forward and maintain hitting the middle in a split pattern, after which Wilkinson then switches over to the switch pattern because he wants to put Jason Robinson up against the French forwards. He makes ground, passes the ball to Steve Thompson, and Steve Thompson goes down and the ball is secured. Now you'd think they would go into a killer option now. They don't. The ball goes out to Wilco and he passes to a pass to break midfield set who put the ball in and try to get on the front foot. However, they don't go for a slide option. Instead, they maintain the split, rucking and picking and going to try and get some go forward. Now here, they go to Charlie Hodgson on the right split. He goes to ground and eventually the ball gets recycled. This is after Dan Luger takes it up the guts and makes a little bit of ground. Now from here, we can imagine what pattern they're going to establish, and we are quite right. They're basically at the 15 metres, they go for the smart pattern, and you can start to see the killer group move in. All the forwards start moving in, ready to start trucking the ball up and getting the 15 metres occupied. They start running hard options off 9 and the French defence start moving in to cover these options. However, it isn't done yet and they start to go to the blind side to try and get more Frenchmen in this channel. When they finally have enough French defenders in, the ball goes to Greenwood and Greenwood puts Robinson through the 13 channel. There is no chance, he goes over for the try. Against New Zealand, we know what's coming. The defence on the far side is occupied and there's no way that there's going to be a split. Therefore, England run the switch pattern. It also assists that McCaw's moved out of position and this line for England is considerably more exploitable. From here, England need to set up their new midfield stack. As such, they go for the smart pattern. They send in Thompson on the carry and then he is followed by Vickery on the next phase. It's a small killer group because 2 of England's forwards are currently in the sin bin, but Vickery does a very good job. England have now had the time to establish their pass to break midfield set and they use it. Wilkinson puts Johnson through on his out to in line which draws in the All Black outside defenders. Because of this, there is now space out wide, which England exploit with their slide pattern. Greenwood and Lucy move over and therefore have numbers on this portion of the All Black line. England need to now try to draw numbers away from the 15 metre channel, which is why instead of running a killer, they actually run a split to try and draw numbers over and spread the line. This works very successfully. We can see a lot of All Black defenders have moved over and as such the right split is the right option. England goes to Lucy at first receiver, who trucks the ball up as the pass was a little bit gone. Wilco then takes the ball at pace and gets his boys into the 22. Attacking wise, this was one of England's best sequences under Woodward. England did this with 13 men, and it was all because they trusted their systems and their breakdown enough that they could flood one side of the field and therefore get numbers where they shouldn't have had any numerical advantage. Now the penultimate attack sequence we're going to look at is Ireland, 2003. We know the situation here. England used their twin set to get the ball wide and eventually will establish a slide pattern with Lawrence Dallaglio and Josh Lucy coming around the corner to further extend the line and further tire them out. Lucy goes to ground and you would think that the killer would be set here and England are set for it, but instead they want to get the ball wide. As such, they ignore the potential killer group and go to Steve Thompson, who trucks it up the centre, after which you can see England establishing their slide pattern. The Irish cannot get numbers around in time, meaning England have numbers, and as such they go forward with footwork and get on the offensive. But from here, they now have numbers, and the killer group is established. Trevor Woodman picks a quick pick and go and goes straight to ground, and you can start to see the smart pattern is now set up. England are attacking the 15-metre channel with numbers, and you can start to see the Irish starting to wilt. Now we know that the smart pattern is used in preparation for the backline, and as such we see the killer group congregating the 15 metres, repeatedly going and repeatedly striking in the 15-metre channel, getting ready for the backline to be used. Now that enough Irish defenders have been concentrated in this area, the backline is ready. The ball goes to Robinson, to Wilkinson, to Leonard, and then to Lucy, finished off by Luger, who scores the try. This sealed the Grand Slam with a comprehensive victory in the last game of the Six Nations. Against Australia, we see a pass to break midfield set and then the slide pattern go into effect. Neil Back runs a pick and go, and then England start to work the blindside as they traditionally do in the killer pattern. Robinson picks and goes and runs the switch with Thompson, trying to gain a little bit of ground. They succeed and then make a bit of ground, but what this does is allows Richard Hill to commit Sterling Mortlock, putting Jason Robinson down the wing and making a huge break. From here, they have a backline ready and they want to use it immediately. However, this little cluster means that they can't get the ball wide as quickly as they'd like. The ball does go, but it does not go to hand, and as such it goes to Tyndall, who re-establishes the killer group. England set the smart pattern again, if anything to try and get back into their structure and prepare the backline ready for the next phase. As such, we see Martin Johnson picking and going and the forwards start to congregate around the ruck. The ball goes out to James Simpson-Daniel, puts Ben Cohen in on the missile carry, who goes over and scores the try, which eventually wins England the game. This was a framework that had been given to England's players, but the English players were of a mindset and a leadership ability that they were able to switch between these as they saw fit. Using their high fitness levels and their high performance behaviours, they were able to drive these performances to get better and better and better, which eventually led to them winning the 2003 World Cup. In the end, it came down to a lot of different factors, but the main ones were the outside-the-box coaching, the willingness to embrace new ideas and change, the commando spirit and the leadership they presented, but the main thing that really won them the World Cup was their high-performance culture combined with the right people. We can attribute it to all the 1% changes and the tiny little things, and they did have an effect, but in the end, these things wouldn't have meant absolute jack if they didn't have the mindset to take on board these changes, take on board these learnings, and keep on improving. Making this video has been a long road. We still have to do the defence and kicking, which technically is coming up in the next video, and were most likely the things that really won England the World Cup. That is for another time, however. Today, we hopefully showed that England were far more than a 10-man rugby team. They were a 15-man total rugby playing team. They were innovators, they were pioneers, they were team players, and they were worthy champions of 2003.